You grew up in the Chicagoland area, admittedly obsessed with your appearance, wanting to be a model. How does a young girl go from that to being an activist for crusading against judging on appearance?
Well, as you said, I grew up in a family that was very concerned with beauty and fashion and appearance, and I tried very hard to meet that standard and worked very hard, spent a lot of my time and energy doing that. I used to wear false eyelashes to go to high school.
I remember those.
Not only false eyelashes, I cut eyelashes into little individual clumps and put them on one by one when Twiggy was the supermodel of the era.
Oh my God.
So I've paid my dues. I definitely
One must suffer for one's art in whatever form, yes.
Exactly. So by the time I was probably in my 20s or so, having, obviously done other things. I was a good student, and that wasn't my only preoccupation, but it was always underlying. So having done that for quite a long time by that point, I began to really feel this is a bit oppressive. This is taking up a lot of my personal sort of resource in various ways. And I also began to think more deeply as I looked around the world and realized that although I definitely judged people based on their appearance, and sad to say, in various respects I still do. I think none of us can avoid that entirely. I began to realize that my judgments, my initial judgments, were basically always wrong. They were never really the full story of who it was that I was encountering. And also realized I don't want to be judged that way from others. I don't want my value to be equated with my appearance. And so I started to kind of try to go at it and unravel that. And ultimately I felt like there needed to be a word in the general vocabulary that I had never heard to describe this phenomenon that we all understand so well. And so I started using the word appearance-ism to connote that appearance-based judging that I was thinking a lot about. And so by that time I was beginning to, I think, realize that my dreams of becoming a supermodel were fading. Thankfully. And
yes, best left to Zoolander.
And that my concern was taking me, in this other direction. So I began to understand that racism, the way that it plays out in our culture, is really pretty much appearance-ism, that people take a look at someone and they make a snap judgment based on appearance, what box they think they should slot that person into, and then what they think that means. So of course you're right, the murder of Ricky Birdsong, which took place on the corner where I live in 1999, was, terribly shocking and tragic and traumatic. By that time I was very much immersed in this issue and already doing work around anti-racism, pro-tolerance, anti-bias work, this issue of appearance-ism. And I realized that his murder was based solely on his appearance, that terrible tragedy happened only because as the murderer drove down the street, he looked and made this very instantaneous judgment. And that was horrifying to me, the extreme to which this can be taken. And in the course of my own sort of research and exploration of this subject, I began to realize that every single culture has something akin to what we would call fashion, that throughout human history there has been some sort of way that, obviously they probably weren't calling it fashion in the caves, but something began to take hold about what was the norm of how to look. And as you look from culture to culture, you can see, it's to me a very fascinating study of the various things that can take hold. So when I do programs, I always bring this little object. Do you know what that is?
It's a shoe, and I am guessing from the strange form of it, it would be a shoe to accommodate the turned under toes of a Chinese woman.
Exactly.
In the imperial era.
Exactly. So the foot binding of women was a practice that reigned in China for 1,000 years. Isn't that phenomenal? It wasn't just, you know, the fashion of even a few decades or 100 years. This lasted for 1,000 years, and it was basically crippling to girls and women. They would, you know, bind the little girl's foot very, very tightly until it would grow deformed into this little tiny lump of a foot, I guess. And this little 3-inch shoe would have been the size of an adult Chinese woman. This is the full scale.
That's the actual shoe.
That's the actual shoe that would fit. And you were valued, your worth was gauged by how small your foot was. And you can look in various cultures. There are many references that I use when I do programs from different cultures. And what's so interesting to me about that is the question of how does this happen? What mechanism in the society makes something like that become the norm and everybody buy into it and accept it?
And even the ideal.
Right. And when you look from culture to culture, there isn't rationality. You can't say, I mean, for example, when you're in the culture yourself, you don't notice it because it has become normalized. So when we say, well, why are we wearing this style of glasses frames versus the ones that, you know, are in my drawer from 20 years ago? Why shoulder pads, you know, some season and this season? No, absolutely not. They look foolish. It's arbitrary, it's irrational, yet we can become convinced to do so. And so hence, you know, there was an advertising campaign, not in Vogue magazine in China during that period, but something that was operating to make that happen. And when this kind of advertising or propaganda gets taken way to the extreme, it can lead to incredible destructive things going on. So we know how that functions, say, with racism. We know that when we go to movies, we know immediately who the good guy is and the bad guy is, pretty much, because the good guy is the handsome one, and the bad guy is the one who isn't attractive, swarthy, or whatever. And even the movies that we see as very little children, you know, even the Disney movies, for example, teach us that lesson.
Simba is a light-colored lion and Scar is dark.
Yes, that sort of thing. So it's very insidious, and it really is very powerful the way that takes hold. And what I became very interested in then was, how do we begin to see one another and certain groups as the other with a capital O? How does that happen, and where can that go? So when we look at the really awful things that humanity has done, when we look at war, when we look at genocide, when we look at racism, when we look at slavery, all of those have a component of advertising and propaganda and media that were employed to make that possible. So we understand that the Nazis had their propaganda campaign that was against Jews and other groups of people. And equated and making them ugly. That's a very, very common thing that happens in propaganda. We did that during World War II to the Japanese. When you look at the cartoons from that era, when you look at the history of slavery, there was a kind of a campaign, a true campaign that was waged very convincingly, even from very academic and scholarly sources, to convince people that those who were enslaved were less than fully human.
Or that they were inferior.
Exactly.
Which is very similar to the scholarly campaign to scientifically justify anti-Semitism in Europe.
Yes. So all of those things became of terrific interest to me. So then, going a little forward from 1999, when Ricky Birdsong was murdered, to 2000,